You are listening to True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions. I'm Morgan Loew, and I'm here with my co-worker, Kim Powell, and we are here with this special episode of the podcast because there are some breaking developments in this case. Kim, what happened this week?
Yeah, a lot has kind of dropped in this one police report from Gilbert Police. So, of course, about a month ago, we got Chandler Police releasing their evidence, and that was a whole lot. And now we have Gilbert Police releasing not only a police report, but submitting charges against Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell for the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreau.
And so Brandon Boudreau is probably a name that most people are not familiar with because this is what was happening with Brandon was sort of tangential. It was off on a tangent compared to the main storyline, which is the missing kids, the spouses who died, and Alex Cox, who passed away. Brandon Boudreau was married to Lori Vallow's niece. And when all of this was happening in the fall of 2019, Brandon Boudreau said, hey, somebody shot at me. Somebody tried to kill me in Gilbert. And so this whole report, which kind of came out of nowhere because we didn't have much of an indication that that case was still being investigated.
Right.
That dropped this week. So Kim, what did Gilbert Police find out about this?
They found out a lot. It was 304 pages. A lot of it's still redacted, of course. They also released the body camera footage. So I'll start with that because that's the first thing I watched was the body camera footage of the officers that responded to him saying, hey, someone just shot at me. He was pulling into his house that he just moved into a couple days prior. As he's pulling into his house, someone in a Jeep opens the rear back window or the back door and shoots at him. And he speeds off in fear, understandably, calls 911. They show up and he says, yeah, there was a dark-colored Jeep sitting out. It had a Texas license plate. But it had, they opened up the back hatch and there was a gun with a muzzle. So right away, I mean, now that we know so much in this case, it's, we can pinpoint the kind of connect the dots ourselves. But at the time, like you said, it was kind of put on the back burner a little bit because the missing kids took precedent as well as the dead spouses. But this really, when I read the report, kind of tied everything together. And it was clear that they never stopped investigating Brandon's attempted murder. It was just a small part in all this that kind of keyed it all together.
And there are these breadcrumbs that led them to the final conclusion that they have. But the first piece of that breadcrumb was the Jeep that Brandon says was the getaway vehicle.
Right. That
was Charles Vallow's Jeep. And Charles Vallow, Lori Vallow's husband, who Lori Vallow's brother shot and killed, claiming it was self-defense. Lori is now charged with conspiracy to commit murder, Charles Vallow's death. So Charles had just died, and Gilbert Police find that Lori had taken his Jeep and they had sort of given it to Alex Cox. He was driving around in it. So clue number one, Jeep belongs to dead ex-husband, and that means that it's tied back to Lori or Alex. And that was the first sort of clue in this.
Right.
But Chandler, I keep saying Chandler, it's Gilbert PD was able to tie a lot more evidence, and some of that was cell phone data where they could pinpoint where Alex was. What did they do with that?
So the Jeep was actually driven by Tylee after Charles's death up until she disenrolled. But then, as we know now, September 8th or 9th, that was when she was last seen alive. So then we can assume that's when Alex kind of took over that Jeep. And according to the report, he's kind of prepping it for this shooting. So it says right here on September 25th, he took the Jeep to a window tinting place to get all the windows tinted on that. And police considered that okay, they're trying to make it so they're unrecognizable by anyone on the street or any surveillance cameras. And then they also take the back tire off and they take out the back seat, which I found really interesting because way back when, before they even found the kids' bodies, remember we had that surveillance video at the storage unit, and you could see, I believe it was Lori and Chad, and they were wheeling a tire. They're kind of rolling a tire in and out of the storage unit. And they also had what looked like, I guess now, a back seat, something like a large rectangular object. And it says in the report they were storing it in this storage unit where now the kids' belongings were as well. So it was a really methodical attempt at his life. It wasn't just a spur of the moment action.
And we looked at that video because that surveillance video was released, and we could see them doing something, but we had no idea that investigators now believe they were prepping for another crime in that video, and we had no idea. We just saw it looked odd what they were doing. So Gilbert PD, with the help of the FBI, they were able to trace Alex Cox's movements from Idaho back to Gilbert and then back to Idaho at the time of this shooting. One of the things that stood out to me that I saw in here is sort of a recurring theme in this case with Lori and Chad, and that is life insurance policy. And at the time, it looks like at the time of Melanie Boudreau and Brandon Boudreau's divorce, so this is Lori's niece and her husband are getting a divorce. Why would Chad or Lori want him dead? And some of what we've heard is that they believed that he was a dark spirit in their whole sort of, their religious ideology. They labeled some people as light spirits and some people as dark spirits. Charles Vallow was a dark spirit. They had to kill him, according to investigators. So they'd also labeled Brandon as one of those dark spirits. But it is, at the very least, coincidental that he had a life insurance policy, because Charles Vallow had a life insurance policy that Lori tried to access. We know that Tammy Daybell had a life insurance policy that they access. And these may be coincidences, but prosecutors may allege that this was motive. Why did they want to kill the niece's ex-husband? Maybe it was a dark spirit issue. Maybe it was a life insurance policy issue. That just stood out to me when I read that. What stood out to you out of this as being noteworthy?
Yeah, I think I can echo exactly what you just said. Life insurance is a big thing. It's clear money is important to them, and if they want to label it as dark spirits, that's their thinking, their way of thinking. Investigators believe that they use their religious beliefs to justify all of this. It was noted in here, Brandon and his wife Melanie were just at the end stage of their divorce when this shooting happened, and she had not canceled her, I think she had to fill out a form or something for the life insurance policy, and that never happened. And then it should be noted, Melanie was also in Arizona when all this happened, but Brandon had seen her that morning. He dropped off their child with her when the other three went to school, and then he comes home, and investigators believe Alex was the one that shot at him. So
the sort of conclusion, the investigative conclusion of this is that Gilbert Police have recommended to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office that Chad and Lori be charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the shooting at Brandon Boudreau. They also mentioned that they would have charged or arrested and recommended charges against Alex Cox, but Alex died in December of that same year of natural causes, according to the medical examiner. So this is another round of charges, criminal charges that involve murder, attempted murder, with Chad and Lori.
Yep.
I mean, these charges are starting to add up.
They really are. And like you said, Brandon isn't really a well-known player in this case, but he was the one who survived. And so he really is important to this whole investigation because he had firsthand knowledge, talking to his ex-wife, learning from her behaviors, and he is the one that can speak out on all of this. And it also, another thing that stood out to me in this report was that they suspected Melanie this entire time. They said our suspicions are increasing against Melanie. And it says at the bottom of this recommended criminal charges that as of right now, as of this submitting, Melanie is not facing any charges.
As of now, as of this supplement, charges are not being submitted against Melanie Boudreau Pawlowski. Pawlowski is her new married name. And that is interesting that they added that.
Right.
But there's a lot of information that's been redacted in here. Mm-hmm. And it's, you sort of have to look at the tea leaves, but you can also read what's around the redactions, and it seems to indicate that some of what Melanie knew or what Melanie might have been involved in was redacted from this police report. There are so many other little things in here that sort of stand
little
out.
Things. There was one part where detectives brought her in for questioning. I think that was the day after Brandon was shot at. And he never said why he was questioning her. She just willingly went to Gilbert Police and started asking her some questions. And eventually, the detective noted, I told her her husband or ex-husband was shot at. And it notes her expression did not change, as if she knew about it. But Brandon never told her because she never answered her phone or any of the text messages that he tried to send her that day. That alone is interesting. And then her dad was interviewed by detectives quite a few times, and he was saying, yeah, my daughter's behavior had been changing. He'd been hanging out with Lori more. That's her aunt. Her behavior changed. She became more spiritual and had kind of these interesting beliefs now. And when I confronted her about it, she said, well, maybe it was his coworker who shot him. Maybe he shot at himself. Like, you don't know. And she got really defensive. So I think, like you said, there's little things among this entire 300-page report that I can see why they added it at the bottom, because it is someone that people have been talking about. I know you interviewed her.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that in a second here. But in addition to this involvement and now these charges, the divorce proceedings between Brandon and Melanie were messy. It was a messy divorce. And a lot of what we found out about Lori and Chad and their religious beliefs and, what they were talking to people about came from these divorce proceedings of a niece and nephew-in-law. So although, Brandon Boudreaux is a name that, as we said, isn't automatically connected to this case, it is because of him and this divorce proceeding that we knew a lot about what was going on behind the scenes. And Kim, as you mentioned, I sat down with Melanie and her new husband, Ian. It was about a year and a half ago. I think it was May of 2020 and we did an interview with them. And I asked, most of the interview, I was asking what Lori was like, what Chad was like, because at that point, the story was completely focused on Lori and Chad, and did she know where the kids were? Because she moved to Rexburg, Melanie did, right at about the time the kids disappeared, or right after the kids disappeared. And my main question was, you got there, that Lori has 2 kids, and you didn't see them? Was that odd? And so most of the interview, she was explaining that Lori was saying she was protecting the kids, that the kids were okay, they were alive. But I did ask about the situation with Brandon and the shooting, and I asked her point blank, did you have anything to do with this? And she said, absolutely not. She had some very disparaging things to say about Brandon. And when you're a reporter and you're looking into a case like this, divorces are messy, and it's hard to take anything seriously from one side or the other, whether it was Brandon's accusations against her or her accusations against Brandon. So at the time, that was not incredibly newsworthy. But looking back now, it's interesting to look at some of the things that she told me at the time, that she had nothing to do with the shooting of Brandon, that Brandon maybe made this up, and, you know, these excuses similar to what she told the investigators. That's kind of what she told me when we sat down at that point.
Right. And I remember, you know, how we got to know Melanie and Brandon was through that divorce proceeding, but also through the custody of their children, because Brandon took their kids and moved to, I believe it was Utah, with his parents, just to keep them safe. He didn't know what the heck was going on. JJ and Tylee were missing, and Melanie was fighting back for custody and saying that, hey, I haven't seen my kids in months. And I'm reading this report, and she's texting Brandon saying, I'm moving to Idaho with or without the kids. And, you know, it kind of supports his story a little bit. All these messages that she's sending saying, you know, I'm leaving with or without the kids. You know, she put their belongings on the street curb. I believe we have some photos of the U-Haul when she abruptly moved. So it's interesting. I mean, like you said, in divorce proceedings, it's messy. And I remember covering it, and I was like, how are we going to do this?
Yeah, it was one of those things where you're like, I mean, we're not in the business of covering divorces, but there were interesting and important details that came out of that proceeding. I just found one of the lines here that Melanie told me, and I was talking about whether I was asking her about whether Lori was involved with Charles's shooting at that time. This was before Lori was charged. And Melanie says, I can't attest to that, but I do know that Charles was there with an agenda. She's saying Charles was there the morning that he was shot with an agenda. That's Lori's that's their idea behind this, is that Charles came and he stirred up trouble, and that's why the shooting happened. So he says Charles was there with an agenda, and that he was working with Brandon and with Kay. And so Kay Woodcock, Charles's sister. So she's telling me in May of 2020 that Brandon and Charles and Kay were all working together. And we know from the text messages, the emails, and the investigation that's been done is that Lori and Chad and Alex, according to the investigation, wanted Charles out of the way. They were angry at Kay because she was stirring up trouble. And according to this, they viewed Brandon the same way. Was it because he had a life insurance policy, or was it because he was a dark spirit? I think those are questions that may come out if this ever goes to trial. And that's probably the next big set of questions here is, what are the chances the Maricopa County Attorney's Office is going to indict them on these charges? They're facing charges in Rexburg, Idaho. They're already facing criminal charges here, or Lori is. But this would be Charles also facing the charges here. So what do you think? I mean, knowing what we know, the case is on hold right now in Idaho. What is the status of Lori's case in Idaho?
Oh, that's still stayed. She is still in that state hospital in Idaho. There's been some new developments, of course, with that, with her calling an LDS attorney at the recommendation of one of her doctors, saying that it's part of her homework. And of course, we don't know what she said to that attorney, but that attorney then called the prosecutor. So now there's kind of a bit of a mess, for lack of better terms, in that sense. But at the end of the day, it's still a stayed case. It's not moving yet, but there's a lot of subpoenas now.
Yeah, and they haven't officially bifurcated the case. Chad and Lori are still co-defendants.
Correct.
The longer this goes on, probably the better chance prosecutors have and defense attorneys of separating the cases and kind of going ahead with Chad's case while this mental health issue works itself out with Lori. But the fact that she is being held, she's incompetent to stand trial there, that doesn't necessarily have a bearing on cases here. There are different standards for incompetence in Arizona than there are in Idaho, and a different process. So I would imagine that it is possible that prosecutors here could say, well, we don't recognize your incompetence finding there. We're going to see if we can extradite her to Arizona to face charges here. And I think that behind the scenes, that's really one of the questions that a lot of people who are watching this case are waiting for. What are the prosecutors here going to do? Are they going to stand in line and wait, or are they going to move forward and try to see if they can find her competent here and face these charges? So, final thoughts from looking at what happened today. Or not today, sorry, this week.
I was like, oh no, what happened
What
today?
happened this week. I mean, I can tell you my final thoughts are that this is just another example of how this case is not over. There are still investigations going on. There are still unanswered questions. And this one, not the main character in this or one of the main characters, but now we have conspiracy to commit murder charges potentially coming against Chad and Lori for part of the case that most people weren't even aware existed.
Right. I think, and I know I've said it before, but what stands out to me most when I read these reports is how thought out everything was. It wasn't a spur of the moment shooting. It wasn't, oh, I'm mad at this person, I'm going to go do something bad. It was planned for weeks, if not months, if not maybe even a year, because this all kind of started when Chad and Lori met in 2018. So, yeah, it's not over. And I had someone downstairs just ask me, when do you think this will be over? And I have no idea.
We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you. None of us are going to try to be able to see the future there. Well, we are going to continue to follow this case and bring you any new developments that come. And if there are big developments like this one, we'll add a special podcast like this one to our True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions podcast. Thank you for listening, Kim. Thank you for getting on this story this week and bringing it to air and now to this podcast.
Yeah, anytime. I'm here for more police reports.
Okay, and we will, you all will hear from us later.